In the first exercise, you created a variable for the size of the circle, but we were still hand coding and putting in raw numbers for things like the position. So in this exercise, you're going to practice. We're still going to work with a circle, but I'd like you to create three variables, and you're going to initialize all three. This is very similar. You're going to still add the code above the code blocks for setup and draw. So it's basically available to be used below when we're ready. So right up at the top of your code, you can start to create your variables. I want to remind you that you can use let, L-E-T, as opposed to var to create the variable. So it could be something like let circle hors. That's creating it and defining it. And then you'll need equals and some kind of value to start with. So let's see what that could look like. We'll start to jump over to finished version. And by the way, in this case, the circle code hasn't been created yet. There's a little note here. It says add circle below. So if I preview at this stage, I don't see anything yet. And that's okay. But let's jump. I just want to remind you that because you'll need to set up your own circle code and then use the variable names to call them to input those values. So let's jump over to finished version. And right in this section is where I've created the variables. There's three of them. So I use let, which is a keyword that basically says I'm about to create a variable. There's a space and then the variable name that defines it. And then initialize just means that you're adding a value, that you're basically saying there is a variable that's called circle hors and it has some kind of value to start with. So I decided the horizontal position, I'd go ahead and give it 200 as a value to begin with. The vertical position, I've given it 200 also, so it's 200 pixels down. And then I created an initial value of 80. So again, let's telling it we're creating a variable. Circle diameter is my variable name that I'm defining. And then equals 80 is initializing it by giving it a value. So it's basically ready to be used. At this point, we can use the name, circle diameter, or the name of any of these variables to tell it that we want to use these values. And then we'll go down. Next thing I added was below the comment on line 27. I added a circle function, and then inside the parentheses, there should be three arguments, three values that are comma separated. So we remind you that the first one's horizontal position, the second one's supposed to be vertical position, and then for circle, the third value is typically the size. So all I've done is instead of putting numbers in, putting the actual name of each variable. I'm still following the other syntax, like the parenthesis, the comma. I've ended the statement with a semicolon. And the main purpose of this exercise, again, is just kind of practice creating the variables and remembering that you can utilize them then by just inserting the name, as long as you're matching case. And then I have a little extra at the bottom that you might want to experiment with. It says something about experimenting with incremental size change or position change. Just so this plus plus makes sense in the note, I want to bring forward our slideshow for a moment. There's really good information back in this slideshow. On page 28, it starts to talk a little bit about having incremental changes, where say if you had a variable called x, that while you're using it in code, that you can do things like x plus 1 to tell it that you want to increase a value. Actually, by the way, in this slide, they're kind of reminding you to make sure that if you're redefining the value, that you do have x equals. At this point, it's following the initial definition. Like here, let is saying x is a variable called x. It has a value of 0. So it's the initial defining, initializing that variable. And then right down here, it's redefining it. At this point, it's saying we're going to give a new value to x. We don't need let anymore. It already exists. But by putting in the name of the variable equals, you can at that point change its initial value. So they're redefining it. It's kind of interesting to see this because it's saying you can use x plus 1, like whatever the original value was, you can incrementally change it. And that can be useful in a lot of ways, actually. There's a related slide if we move down a little further after these examples. That's still talking about incremental changes, but this introduces a shorthand form. So you might want to review this slide. It's kind of saying you could do something like add plus plus after the variable name to tell it automatically you want to increase by 1. So there's a couple different patterns like minus minus to decrease whatever your x value is by 1 incrementally. So that's slide 31 if you want to review that. And that relates to this note. It's kind of saying, again, you could experiment with that. For example, what if we went to here where we're using the name of the variable for diameter, and you can use the shorthand where you type in plus plus to indicate incremental change. And you can see that immediately. It's telling it to grow in size. And by the way, because this is inside the draw function, it's looping. It's doing that automatically over and over again. I can hit play again to refresh and run the code from scratch. So I think that's fun too, to just see how this, just typing plus plus made a huge difference there. You can experiment because that's also going to be useful to do incremental changes sometimes in something like a game or animation to make an object move. Let's say you went to the vertical position variable name and you try adding plus plus there. That's telling it to, each time it loops and runs this code, to increase the vertical position by 1, essentially making it move down, since again every bit of code inside the draw code block loops. It's basically playing over and over again all by itself. That's why it's moving 1 pixel, plays it again, moves another pixel, plays it again, moves it another pixel. That's why you see the motion. You could also do things with minus minus. That's the one that's incrementally reducing the value. So there it's reducing the size. Bring that back up. So kind of extra thing there if you want to experiment with that. And again, when you know where the slide was, if you want to go back and read a little bit about that incremental change, if you go there.